third and final panel of a long but super productive day. And I'm just gonna briefly introduce the panelists and the moderator and where we're gonna jump into it. So the third panel is titled Latent Landscapes of Data. And these are basically projects and presentations that look at how data can illuminate new understandings or perspectives about urban landscapes. But at the same time, urban landscapes that are generated in the aftermath of data and the ascendance of data and importance within socio-political, economic dynamics of contemporary societies. So looking at the infrastructure also that makes these data and data technologies possible. We're gonna hear from first from Claire Lister, who is a Chicago-based architect whose work sits at the intersection of architecture, landscape, infrastructure, with emphasis on how the material, metabolic, and socio-technical systems in the city territorialize. There we go, I got it. The built environment and the implications of this for design. Her work is delivered across multiple platforms, from books to articles, from exhibitions to speculative design proposals. And she is the author of Learning from Logistics, How Networks Change Cities, and the co-editor of the Third Coast Atlas, A Prelude to a Plan, as well as States of Entanglement, Data in the Irish Landscape, which was also the project for the Irish Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, past one. Then we'll hear from Devin Dobrowolski, who is an assistant professor of architecture here at UVA, where his primary teaching role is in the design of thinking, in the design thinking and design practices concentration. He has worked at multiple Berlin-based and US-based offices, and has served as an assistant instructor and teaching assistant for a wide variety of courses, including integrated building systems, construction methods, engineering projects and community service, landscape representation, and so on. Devin was the 2018 recipient of the Butler Traveling Fellowship awarded by the School of Architecture at Princeton, for his research titled Water as Infrastructure, Mapping the Lower Colorado River Basin. And we'll also hear from Jesse Lecavalier, who uses tools of urban design and architecture to research, theorize, and speculate about infrastructure and logistics. He is the author of The Rule of Logistics, Walmart and the Architecture of Fulfillment. And his design work has been recognized by the Sudbury 2050 Urban Design Competition, the MoMA PS1 Young Architects Program, the Oslo Triennale, and the Seoul Biennale. Le Cavalier was the Daniel Rose Visiting Assistant Professor at Yale School of Architecture and the 2010 and 11 Sanders Fellow at the University of Michigan. And his work has appeared in Cabinets, Public Culture, Places, Art Papers, and Harvard Design Magazine, among others. And the session after the presentations is going to be moderated by Gina Ripple, who is a registered architect, principal, and co-founder of the collaborative architecture firm Mir Collective. Ripple's work is recognized through international awards, competitions, and exhibitions for the translation of material manufacturing techniques into innovative architectural systems, promoting local economic growth. Ripple's upcoming book, The Type V City, Codifying Material Inequality in Urban America, examines the role of wood frame construction and building codes in shaping American material and social vulnerabilities. And Gina is also, in addition to being an associate professor, he is also the chair of the architecture department here at the A School. So with that, I'll leave the podium to Claire to get us started.
Well, it's like NASA up here already. I don't know what to
Too
look
many
at.
screens. Yeah.
Just should I use the mouse, or are you forwarding with the?
Or the keyboard.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for hanging in there. Thanks, Ali, for having me. Congratulations on all your own work on data infrastructure. And I look forward to new articles coming out. Just very quickly, oh, I'm just going to start my 22 minutes. Just very quickly, not to repeat Ali, I'm a professor of architecture at UIC in Chicago. I run a small design-based research firm called CLUA. Having an acronym makes you look much bigger than you actually are. It's just me. And, you know, this term, it's about urban systems and urban infrastructure. In particular, over the last few years, this term socio-technical systems and metabolics and the surprising intersection of those two worlds and how they shape territory. So in the past, I've been looking at logistics, hydrological systems, information systems, and food systems, and mainly speculative work. So I'm completely in awe of the earlier panel that are really kind of out there in the world and putting their research, you know, out there on the ground. But I write books, I'm involved in exhibitions, and I do some speculative design projects that applies some of the theory and research in practice. In titling the presentation for Ali, I just kind of posed it as a question. Can architecture imagine new possibilities for information storage at a time when the data center poses many contradictions from the perspective of land use, energy demand, resource extraction, and digital capitalism? I will identify alternative formal and political typologies that envision the cloud as a catalyst for more socio-environmental outcomes by coupling it with other infrastructure from agriculture to housing. And just a little bit in terms of how I got to looking at the data center. So I'm really looking at the kind of attendant infrastructure of the data industry, in particular, the data center as a typology in the landscape. In 2016, I wrote this book that looked at what we now call logistical platforms, FedEx, Amazon, Ryanair, and earlier logistical platforms actually that now are defunct. And what I realized after writing the book was that logistical systems as we know it, that we use every day in the city, could not survive or could not exist without information technologies. And this kind of, the barcode is kind of set up as a kind of iconic image that communicates our reliance and dependency on technologies, whether it's logistical systems, sorting, scanning, tracking, sequencing, locating, ordering inventories, controlling supply and demand, and enabling this kind of frictionless flow of stuff, information, and people around the world every day. And so a few years ago, I was very fortunate to be involved with this group Annex, which is a collaboration of artists and architects in Dublin. I'm originally from Ireland, although I've been in the US about 20 years now. And all of we were all independently looking at technologies in various shapes or forms in our own individual practices. And so we got together to make a pitch for the Venice Biennale, the Irish Pavilion, which was supposedly in 2020. It was obviously in 2021. And that's where the kind of lingering ideas of the data center as this backstage space to logistics really kind of came to the forefront in my own research. And because we were doing the Irish Pavilion, we had to kind of anchor our research in or filter it from the kind of Irish lens, which wasn't difficult because in 1858, despite that saying 1866, Ireland, the southwest coast of Ireland, in fact, an island called Valentia Island, was the landing point for the first transoceanic transatlantic cable, linking Newfoundland to Ireland. So the first time that the two continents were co-joined physically in 175 million years. This is an amazing painting that was of the Great Eastern, which is the ship. It was the biggest ship in the world at the time. It was the only ship that could carry the weight of the cable across the Atlantic, coming aground on this Irish-speaking, completely impoverished rural landscape. And that was kind of our hook, that the internet, or information communications, started in Ireland 150 years ago, even if it was a colonial project, and I'll get back to that. So the pavilion was called Entanglement. Here's a map of that original cable trajectory. Oddly enough, as some of you might know, in the last 35 years, Ireland has become this kind of hub. Now, I know London claims to be one, Paris claims to be one, Amsterdam claims to be one, for data centers for the large US digital corporations. So Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Facebook, now Meta, have huge mega facilities in and around Dublin, the capital city, and have brought enormous economy to the country, but also now increasingly there's a lot of pushback to these companies because of their reliance on power. The electrical grid is completely used up in Dublin as these facilities can demand as much electricity as a town of 250 or 300,000 people. So there's a huge sort of backlash against their energy use. I'm not going to talk about the pavilion except as context. I'm interested in Dietmar's presentation earlier on, where how do you start to communicate the kind of intangible, ethereal, hidden aspects of data infrastructure to a kind of audience, and in particular a lay audience at the Biennale. Without going too much into it, this is the pavilion. It's a bonfire, which has resonance in Irish pagan, Celtic pagan culture. It's made of steel server racks, the 42 units that you find in a data center. And it's infilled with screens, with plants, with fans, with servers and cables, which all have a kind of representational role in the pavilion itself. The reason why it's a bonfire is that we decided to use the mechanism of heat as the way to tell the story of data, because heat is something you can register. Heat is something that can be legible through thermal cameras and so on. And the bonfire being a kind of primitive fire typology that we felt had immediate significance in the kind of story of Ireland's role. Accompanied with that was a book that Ali mentioned that sort of just collected a story about the making of the pavilion and the kind of our own individual researches that went into it, accompanied by some solicited essays for people. It also doubled as an access or an atlas describing some of these spaces. At about the same time, oddly enough, I was fortunate to win one of the SOM Foundation Research Prize, the one in 2019, which is an annual faculty-led research faculty-led research design studio at a school of architecture, landscape architecture, and there's a different theme every year. The theme in 2019 was shrinking our agricultural footprint. And so to cut a long story short, the project was called Hot Farms, How Emails Grow Tomatoes. And basically that tied together some of the research I had been doing for the biennial. This is a map of all those data farms outside Dublin. This kind of pink craggy line is a subterranean internet cable, very fast fiber that links all of the cables or those data centers. And I began to kind of think about this term farm. So the pitch for the Hot Farm was looking at the data center, and which is also called a data farm. I'm not inventing that term, as you all know, and began to look at the enormous footprints of these data farms in Dublin. This is Amazon's new facility. This building has now been complete. They're building 9 buildings outside a residential area in Dublin at the cost of like something $1.8 billion. This was just kind of looking at mapping the energy systems that I described. And there's a claim that by 2027, a third of the country's energy will be demanded by data centers. And so there's a huge kind of emphasis now on developing renewable wind farms as a way to sustain the economy. In tandem with that, in Ireland, if any of you've been to Ireland, this is probably the image that you would conjure up in your mind. We are an agricultural culture as well as an agricultural economy. 70% of the land is farmed, and it's in livestock farming because we have this amazing earth. The problem with this is, and particularly now as new mandates in the EU are dictating that all countries lower their emissions. Countries with high agricultural economies are having enormous challenges because they have to completely reinvent their farming sector as a way to keep carbon emissions down. And so Ireland, we're really bad. Look at us, we're up here on the kind of like 30% of our emissions comes from agriculture. So we have a lot of stuff. So the idea for the hot farms was, let's put these two farms together. The data center makes heat because the servers are cooled and that exhaust air is kind of left over or is often released into the atmosphere. So the idea was, this is the kind of diagram, the loop. Your Instagram messages are stored in a data center. The heat from the data center can be filtered, is then sent to a greenhouse because the greenhouse can proliferate with heat. And then that starts to feed into thinking about an alternative farm practices in the country, releasing land that was previously used for livestock for other uses. And so this was the kind of logo that kind of Twitter feeds. And then it goes back to kind of my general interest in the kind of overlap of the socio-technical and the metabolic, and how nature and technology can have these new productive combinations moving forward. And so these are images, Tim Hagen's images of the Westlands in the Netherlands taken at nighttime, these amazing photographs of the LED lights in the glass in the greenhouses. And as I did some research, it was interesting that the two farms actually share a lot in common. Both have incredibly controlled interior environments. Like the data center is controlled to the point that a speck of dust can do damage to a server. So they're hyper controlled, and the greenhouse is somewhat similar. They both have a kind of propagate a kind of surreal aesthetic that's actually a conceit, but a kind of sublime beauty associated with the images we see of the two farms. And that was kind of interest to me. They also demand, or they're also kind of pushing this idea of the post-human in terms of both robotic, automated, machine learning, AI systems in how both systems operate. In fact, in precision agriculture, the greenhouse is practically a computer at this point. So again, a very fine line between the two ecosystems. From a territorial standpoint, a kind of network diagram is not all that dissimilar from a kind of agricultural field. And it's interesting too that the crossover between the farms in 2010, Yahoo designed a data farm based on the design of a chicken coop as a way to naturally help with ventilation of the servers. Both depend on heat in very different ways. This is an image of fruit walls, the Mur de Pêche in Paris in the 18th and 19th century, which were a series of hot walls built to cultivate tropical fruits at a latitude that you wouldn't typically find peaches and lemons and oranges and so on. And the notion that heat could be a resource that could be shared between the two systems was also of interest. So the studio, I ran a seminar and then a studio. Basically, I had 12 students, a mixture of undergrad and grads. And we ended up doing projects in 3 categories. One was looking at the kind of hyperscale data center and the kind of large regional landscape and the exchange between the hyperscale data and the greenhouse. A second group were looking at marine systems. And a third group were looking at smaller scale, almost domestic, do-it-yourself vertical farming technologies and distributed data systems, which I'll talk about in a moment. So I'm going to very quickly go through 3 projects. This was one project that linked the fragmentation of a data center into smaller pieces in the logic that perhaps there was greater kind of flexibility. Of course, the data center people wouldn't agree because their whole MO is to develop on economies of scale. But the logic, if you fragmented the space into smaller spaces, that perhaps they could have more agency in the built environment and double as kind of public spaces. Sort of like I'm remembering Alexander de Hoog's objectification of infrastructure, that essay that he wrote a few years ago. The student looked at both typical data storage systems and, a controversial emerging science of using plant DNA as data storage, and then rewilding as a kind of alternative agriculture source, and then putting those together into a kind of data center meets national park type model. Did a lot of research on Net Castle, which is a very well-known rewilded, it's like an old aristocratic farm outside Heathrow Airport, which has become kind of world famous for its rewilding initiatives. And so the kind of coexistence of the data farm, some public program that was attached to each of the small figural data centers, and then kind of speculating on the kind of overlap of these systems together. This was also, each student was obliged to do a metrics diagram that would start to correlate the different systems in the project, so that, it wasn't just kind of a naive design project, but there was some sort of robust rigor there. The second project, very quickly, was a kind of floating project that looked at underwater data storage that Microsoft are testing on the Orkney Islands off the coast of Scotland at the moment as a way to keep the servers cool. And so she also started to look then how you could combine that with seaweed and kelp farming. Seaweed farming can be used as an alternative source of protein, but it's also very critical in alternative animal feeds, and it keeps the kind of methane levels down in bovine populations. Again, just in terms, and then of course, very conscious of how the architect and the designer sort of finds a place within these kind of combination of systems. You can start to see that these floating modules aggregate in different coastal areas on the west coast of Ireland, where there is an indigenous seaweed economy at the moment. And then starting to kind of build on these platforms, a kind of research kelp farm station where people can come. The kelp growing season is actually very fast. Kelp is extremely robust. It grows in abundance in a very short time. And the idea was that here's the section, that the air from the submersibles would dry the kelp. The problem with kelp is that it's like slush when it's harvested. So it's incredibly heavy, which means it's expensive to transport and to process. But when it's dried, it's like featherweight, and you can collect an enormous amount of it, which makes it more efficient to transport because there's not many processing plants for seaweed. And so there's an example of this kind of industrial symbiosis that I'm trying to kind of talk when the waste of one system is used as a resource for another. And then just starting to kind of image those areas. So there's the kelp drying trays on the lower level of this platform and all the kind of kelp action going on. And then some more metrics, and then sort of this projection where you know, to kind of equal the number of cows and the protein produced by cows. The seaweed farm would have to extend, you know, from the North Sea down almost to this Cornwall and almost to the kind of coast of Normandy in order to replace the protein. But kind of interesting that the project starts to kind of expand beyond national borders and take on a kind of new scale. The last project is very much looking at a residential neighborhood in the region of a data center and looking at micro farming systems, cricket farming. Crickets love heat, to other new kind of emerging devices at the micro farming scale. The student also looked at micro data systems, in particular this Quarno, which is a radiator. A French company will remotely store actually rendering for Disney movies or Pixar movies. So the Minions movie, I was told, was farmed out to radiators in housing in Bordeaux in France, where the minions are heating your apartment. And so the idea then would be that the minions could also make your lunch. And so again, the student really taking on every surface of the house with a kind of growing system, locating it in a kind of greenhouse. And then it becomes really about living with nature. It was kind of like a commune, where you had people working on data, like maybe, I mean, I don't want to use the word gig economy because that's like not very politically correct, but let's say, you know, young millennials that work for large corporations could live here and work, but they could also use the data here, the data storage maybe for community storage, and also grow for the community. So there was an attempt to recast the political or industrial models of data storage and food production to much more local levels. Again, how many cricket columns you need to replace a number of cows. So, and then we had a website with all of these kind of projects. In tandem with that, well, actually not in tandem, I lie. After that, I wanted to kind of just test in my own practice a couple of different projects that might expand upon the research. And this one was called Farm Life. Interestingly enough, okay, I'm almost done here, stop. Interestingly enough, the municipal area of Dublin have now mandated Amazon in one of those 9 facilities that I showed you to reuse their heat in that particular community. Like that was the kind of mandate. You can build here, but you have to do this. And so that's, I mean, it's a form of district heating, which has been around for a long time. And it's important to note Julia Velkova, who is a Finnish media theorist, I believe, writes about the dangers of valorizing the data center. And I don't mean to suggest that just because we can be creative or productive about the waste heat, that makes the powers be of the data industry okay. It's really just positioning the project more within circular economy, holistic infrastructure, all of these kind of urban design terms out there in the world. This is incidentally then a lot of the tech companies are now also being forced to develop wind farms in different parts of the country, which they're developing the wind farm to give back to the grid as opposed to using that energy directly. Anyway, this project that I was doing, these here we are, the pink are the data centers that exist. The white dashed line is a half-mile or mile radius, I can't remember, around the different facilities, and the yellow rectangles are vacant lots that could be used for housing. And you can see how like the kind of adjacencies in terms of land use, where there's like suburban housing bang up against the data center. And just even from a design end, it seemed there could be a kind of middle ground. And that if your house is getting heat from your emails, it should look a lot different than a house that's getting heat from another source. So we're really using this as a kind of alibi to think about new housing. So the idea was that the air, and I've done some research into water systems and air systems, like you can actually like transport the air if it's close enough to the data center. If you're further away, it's more efficient to for a heat exchanger to the hot air becomes hot water, and then it's much cheaper and quicker to export the energy. But the idea was the heat would we use for a vertical farm and a commercial greenhouse, and then you would build this housing ribbon around the edge. And in addition, all the houses on this edge of the ribbon would get their own private hanging greenhouse. And so we picked a site within one of those discs in an area that's already been kind of revitalized on the kind of in an ex-urban environment, and then started to kind of work this up. And so the idea was that there would be a third party that would run the commercial greenhouse and the vertical farm, perhaps somebody that lives in that might also live in the facility. And then if you were so inclined, you could get your own greenhouse. Then just some looking at that, how that works, and plan the different units that might emerge. And then again, going back to that image that I showed, the kind of surreal aesthetic, like how do you leverage that you know, more productively in the imaging of systems projects? Because systems projects, you know, you think of kind of high tech. For me, I think that there's still, we're looking for a language, a formal or a material language to use to express how these systems start to intersect in very real scenarios. So this is the entrance to the kind of units that might take on some farming systems. And then the project becomes kind of, yes, looking at kind of large scale systems, but more looking at how, in this case, agriculture makes community in an edge city landscape that doesn't really have much community. They're kind of scrubby areas on the side of a highway, and they're not very noble places to live. And then this is the last slide. All of this is going toward a book maybe next year that's about both these farm scenarios, but presented under the lens that maybe there is a design project moving forward in where we start to leverage overlaps between socio-technical systems such as the data center with other natural or metabolic systems such as food as a kind of model for urbanism moving forward.
First, I just wanted to, again, thank Ali for the invitation to present some work and some ideas today, and to thank all of the other panelists for sharing their amazing work. It's really been quite an incredible day. And, some of what I'd like to just present today is partially, some of it is kind of, I don't want to say quite work in progress, but they're not all kind of technically finished projects in a way. But they all have to do a little bit with this idea that has been kind of developing through various forms of research and teaching about, data proxies, particularly kinds of data that, may be inherently spatialized or not, but which, says certain things about landscapes or about territories or about cities. And, primarily, I think of myself, I'm not a historian. I'm not really a theorist. I'm a designer, fundamentally trained as a landscape architect first, and then later as an architect. But, through a series of projects have, kind of developed a series of kind of cartographic methods. And some of these things, because of my role in teaching over the last several years, has involved, trying to kind of make first and then theorize secondarily, and try and understand, in the teaching, how to convey and how to build a kind of methodology that empowers students, I think, to utilize data in a way and to work cartographically in a way that they can ask very precise kinds of questions, and maybe also understand which kinds of questions, you know, how to ask those questions differently. So one thing I think about often is like a kind of phase change of data, or a phase change of kind of graphic representation. You know, one thing that I like about, you know, kind of architectural representational conventions is that it's very simple in a sense. You have kind of points, lines, and areas or polygons. And then, you know, in a way, they all kind of convey spatial data in various ways that gets utilized through CAD programs and ArcGIS and things. But they also, you know, largely, especially when you use them in GIS programs and things like that, they are also buckets for various other types of data. And to that, I would also add to the lexicon, the pixel, which I think is a kind of newcomer to the field, which is somehow not quite a point and also not quite a polygon, but somehow something in between, but which is also largely sort of, you know, conveys data in a different way, as both container and image. And so, you know, first, I think what I wanted to do is kind of introduce a kind of prologue to a couple of data sets that I've, you know, come back to many times, both in my own work and my teaching, because one, I've become more interested in kinds of data sets that serve as archives that can kind of build over time, that are robust, and that can show change over time. And, you know, some of those include, for instance, the United States Census and working with census data, and then which also has kind of very interesting and particular relationships to the origins of modern computing, and to kind of more modern sort of satellite imagery. And so in a way, I think what's interesting is that the census as a document, you know, is the idea that collection of data is somehow kind of baked into the democratic American system. You know, the first census, the 1790 census, which was administered by Thomas Jefferson, who at the time was both the Secretary of State and the Census Bureau Director. But that, you know, it basically was one of the first acts of Congress that was carried out to kind of enumerate, to count the citizenry, and to fundamentally determine the representation that all of the states and territories would have at the federal level, and also to determine how much they would pay in taxes. And the initial census, you know, actually only asked 5 questions. The head of the household, all of the head of household, white males over the age of 16 to kind of assess the military and industrial potential, white males under the age of 16, white females, all other freed white persons, and slaves. And of course, you know, the census is not a kind of neutral document. It never has been. It's always been politicized, especially in these kind of early versions where, you know, even the notion of personhood for slaves was kind of in a way dehumanizing. They were counted as 3/5 of a person, as a way of kind of allowing the southern states, which were, you know, had heavy populations of slave ownership, to have more representation in Congress, while also balancing, you know, reducing their tax burden. So in a sense, as the census kind of evolved as a document, and of course these early census, the collection was all kind of done door to door, was done manually. The enumerators would go out and kind of collect all of this information door to door. So very kind of slow and deliberate process. And then over time, the census began to add more kinds of questions, including you know, manufacturing and economic activity. So this is also related to a kind of document later, which I think is quite interesting, with just the act of trying to break down all types of goods that could be produced into a series of categories is in itself a really kind of amazing attempt at kind of categorization and taking note of statistical information. And you can kind of see also, you know, in the order of recorded goods and manufacturers, some of the things that reinforce anecdotally what we imagine life in the early United States was like for both free and not free people, that, you know, the kind of loomed goods and things that were made from these agricultural products like cotton, wool, flax, hemp, and silk was, of course, the largest part of the economy. And that, you know, further in those were, you know, ostensibly being traded domestically and abroad, but that also there's a whole series of other kinds of goods that were just being kind of produced domestically that were necessary for just the advancement of and the building the, you know, the infrastructure of everyday life of a new country, right? And so, you know, moving further into later into the century, I think, you know, this visualization by Charles Joseph Menard, I think also starts to point to, you know, it's one of, I think, you know, not certainly the only, but one of the best and maybe one of the earliest attempts to kind of spatialize a lot of this statistical information, but also to, it also starts to point to some of these converging factors that were happening towards the end of the 19th century that point to a kind of second industrial revolution that historians of science often talk about, where the kind of first industrial revolution with the advent of steam power created this enormous kind of increase in manufacturing that further advances later in the century, including the development of internal combustion engines and other kinds of technological advancements, you know, further increased production, but also produced this problem of kind of, you know, this massive increase in scale, which produced a kind of new kind of political subject, and you know, the office worker, the clerical worker, you know, the you know, enormous increase in the volume of goods being bought and sold and traded and so on and so forth, also produced an enormous increase in the amount of paperwork and bookkeeping and the types of records that needed to be kept in order to also to grow these enormous corporate entities like Sears and Roebuck, or even the Census Bureau itself. So this was also kind of coinciding with the time where even the collection of census data was becoming overwhelming. So at this time, the 1880 census took nearly 8 years, or did take 8 years to tabulate the data. And there was a worry that basically the 1890 census was going to take even longer. So the Census Bureau in 1888 held a competition, which was won by a former Census Bureau employee, Herman Hollerith, who devised this method of a kind of punch card system, based conceptually off the kind of punch card systems used by train engineers. But essentially, there's a card that would have corresponding categories for all of the kind of census demographic data being collected, and then would be kind of processed by being passed over a table with spring-loaded pins that would be, the holes would allow the pin to travel through to mercury below, which would create an electrical kind of connection, which is, you know, a kind of Boolean operation in a way. It's yes or no. The current is telling you yes or no. And what's interesting is that so Hollerith won the competition and won the contract for the 1890 census, and subsequently went on to found a company to kind of market his machines, working with the Dewey Decimal System, some of these other kinds of data management and collection problems of the early 20th century. and later would merge to become International Business Machines in 1924, IBM. So here's shown the IBM Mark I computer. And actually this method of kind of collecting the data was maintained until about the 1950s when it was replaced by computers. But in a way, so, you know, this is a kind of a jump, but the link between this, you know, the census as a kind of baked in statistical document that is inherent to the functioning of the democracy of the United States, in, you know, kind of in concert with, you know, the growing kind of bureaucratic and corporate necessity for, you know, paperwork in line with production, things like that, has these real links to the modern digital era. And then, of course, World War II, the kind of investment in technology and research that, you know, that conflict produced also led in a way, in many ways directly to the next major kind of technological advancement, which also leads to the third kind of data set that I'm interested in, which is the Landsat spatial data archive. So, you know, this image taken by the Apollo 17 crew, the original blue marble image, was really the first time that the image of the Earth was not really speculative. It was actually the index. It was wholly shown as a kind of photograph, and was, you know, kind of quickly replaced by more pixelated versions that are kind of aggregates of multiple images of the Earth. And, you know, the blue marble and even the kind of Google Maps image that you see on your iPhone are these kind of aggregate images. But at the time, these were really compelling images that kind of convinced, that were used to convince the public and the government that some kind of large scale environmental monitoring system would be not only necessary, but, you know, advantageous for a whole host of reasons in the future, and it propelled the kind of political impetus and political will and investment to start the Landsat program, which over the years has, since its initial launch in 1970, has, you know, had kind of continuous spatial coverage of the entire globe, you know, recirculating through every kind of area through the various types of Landsat satellite images and cameras, every kind of inch of the globe recorded every 2 weeks for the past 50 years, basically. So there's this actually kind of incredible record of, you know, changes of the Earth's surface. So I guess, you know, that brings me to, you know, how these have been useful. I mean, I think for me personally, in thinking about how to use spatial information to ask better questions at multiple scales as a designer, and also how to kind of impart some of those, how to, you know, in teaching, I think one of the things that's really valuable in teaching is it kind of forces you to think more clearly about how you're even kind of theorizing your own reasons for doing things. And so, you know, in looking at the learning how to work with the census, I think is an interesting problem, because, you know, the census, you know, and we're used to kind of seeing census kind of choropleth maps already provided, often because census data can be really difficult to work with. It can be kind of unwieldy and challenging. But this is where it gets to kind of this, one of the initial things I mentioned was this kind of phase change of data. So I think one kind of strategy for thinking about how to not just represent data, but how to, you know, how to build a kind of process for doing it is to try and represent things differently. So in this case, you know, taking, I took some of the preliminary results of the 2020 decennial census, which is of course a highly politicized document in and of itself, but trying to represent these kinds of new data, not in the way that we're used to seeing through these kind of choropleth areas of states and counties and things like that. But, you know, in this case, just doing a phase change and using a kind of point as a way of showing, in this case, you know, raw population totals, then showing the data in a different way, looking at population density, right, as another way of kind of understanding not just total numbers of people, but how, you know, the feeling of density, of trying to visualize these in various different ways. And also using census data as a way of asking other questions about kind of American cities. So some of the early research projects that I was involved in as a student were these kinds of projects that looked at the morphology of cities. You know, the Sao Paulo book by Felipe Correa was one that I started working on as a student, and, you know, really developed a lot of methodologies for mapping through working on that. But, you know, in more recently, I've become really interested in kind of phenomena of North American cities in particular, because they do seem so challenging to study, because their form is so seems so difficult to understand what is driving it in a way. And particularly in recent years, as what, you know, we'll see some examples of a kind of melting away from the traditional core of the city to a more densified outer rim. And these visualizations, in this case, these are taking just the census designated places, which are another kind of spatially designated area used by the census, and looking at all of the ones in black that are areas that have more than 100,000 people, and all of the ones that are in gray that have more than 50,000 people. So understanding these cities, Chicago, Los Angeles, Dallas, Fort Worth, you know, to name a few, not just as their kind of administrative boundaries, but as, you know, larger kind of conurbations, and trying to understand actually where the city begins and ends. I think is one way of beginning to ask, I think, larger questions about the built environment that, you know, data and data visualization can help us utilize. So, you know, just as an example, you know, of course, these kinds of redlined maps have been, you know, a huge part, I think, of conversations within, you know, here within the School of Architecture, recently also within kind of journalism, and in Richard Rothstein's book, which of course pointed out the kind of lasting legacies of these types of racial covenants, and you know, both direct and indirect ways that policies of segregation were carried out through housing policy in the United States, and the kind of, you know, lasting effect of these, even in cities and in places where we consider them to be quite either progressive or quite integrated or quite diverse, right? So looking at New York City and actually seeing that there's quite a distinct separation. This is, of course, from a project by the New York Times, published in 2015, but utilizing 2010 census data. For example, you know, another example from the same project looking at Chicago. So there was I think, a really influential project in the 1960s that also, you know, attempted to begin to utilize census data in a way that I think implicitly tried to understand both the kind of demographic and the spatial footprint of American cities in a different way. So Joseph Passano and Richard Saul Werman's Urban Atlas, 20 American Cities, where they kind of, you know, it really is an atlas where they kind of take many of the larger cities, but not necessarily just the largest cities of the 1960 decennial census. And, you know, as you can see, they're kind of, they're taking kind of precisely gridded areas, and looking at and kind of breaking them down and attempting to kind of graphically represent them. And this is at the beginning of the time when satellite imagery and kind of early kind of computational means were also becoming more available, certainly to researchers. And the visualizations, I think, are really interesting because they look in some ways very contemporary. We can understand how computationally you might do something like this today. But I think what's interesting about this method is that it tries to subvert one of the ways in which we're used to seeing this kind of data represented, which is a choropleth map, where the area of the study, whether it's a county or a parcel or a census tract or whatever, is the unit, and you kind of shade it according to what the total is. It's taking a very modernist sort of approach and applying a grid over the whole thing, and then allowing this new point or pixel to kind of carry the data. And just graphically, what it allows them to do also is to make kind of multivariate data comparisons. So not just showing like how many people live here, or the people who make this much money live here, but being able to take multiple types of data at the same time and show them in the same symbol. So to show something like density in relation to median income, or something like that. So there's a kind of underlying methodology which I really appreciate, which I think is so that this project for me was one that was very interesting, and one which I wanted to attempt to kind of update in a way, primarily through the teaching, but this is also something that's become a kind of personal interest in a personal project on its own. So looking at this kind of early results from the 2020 census and having these be a kind of open source research projects that students carried out in the mapping seminar that I would teach. So one of the interesting ways that I was hoping to update the project was to not just take the 2020 census data and recreate the same methodology of Werman and Passano, but to try and actually use more contemporary computational and cartographic means to show these as more dynamic structures, right? So showing it less as a kind of snapshot in time, but learning a kind of methodology for showing, utilizing the census as an archive that's evolving over time to show how actually American cities are changing and evolving. So this is looking at one of the interesting problems or challenges in doing that is looking at, the available census tract data from 1960 compared with what's available today, which is of course full coverage of the entire country. And in this case, well, we'll see the methodology in a second, but in this case, the grid becomes a really powerful tool for kind of normalizing these spatial differences, because census tracts, their boundaries change over time. They're larger, they're smaller. So how do you actually compare, two tracts that have different sizes and shapes and maybe kind of just loosely overlapping one another from two different time periods? Well, the grid can kind of help solve that issue. Another really interesting, I kind of alluded to this before, but very interested in what is the morphology of the city? How do we describe it? And I think even just trying to understand the boundary of the city today is an interesting challenge. So this is like some preliminary mapping, looking at on the north, Cincinnati, Ohio, and on the southern side of this river, Covington, Kentucky, and looking at the fact that actually there's this kind of 10 or 15 mile boundary between what's clearly contiguous kind of urban fabric, even though this part on the northern side of the river is by definition the city of Cincinnati, but you know, at a certain point, you know, the question of whether the administrative boundary is the best representation of the city at large, I think, coincides with a whole lot of other topics that have been touched on today as well. So again, this is where this kind of study of trying to find other ways of defining urban regions, not just in terms of their physical as kind of Saskia Sassen would say, their topographic footprint, but also, you know, in a second, we'll look at their kind of larger geospatial or material footprint, which I think, again, you know, many of the previous presentations have sort of touched on. So, you know, in particularly in coming back to defining methodology, so these are some of the kinds of prompts that in working with my students, I would set up. So asking them to kind of choose a city and kind of have a preference for these sort of smaller, mid-sized American cities, which tend to get less attention than your New York or Los Angeles or Chicago's, but are equally interesting in various ways, Columbus, Ohio. And try and determine whether you want to study it on a short time frame or a long time frame, right? Some cities like Phoenix, you know, between 2010 and 2020 may have changed enormously, right? And answer questions that we often talk about in a loose anecdotal way. Is this city growing or is it shrinking? How can we actually be sure? I mean, the data, we can control the data in a way that can kind of give us answers to that. Is it growing quickly or is it growing slowly or shrinking slowly? Is it gaining density in the core or is it losing density in the core, right? So these are all things that we've kind of come to discuss in urban design and architecture and landscape architecture as generalizations of kind of post-industrial conditions. But, you know, the attempt, at least through my work in teaching, has been to try and become more precise in how these questions get asked and to understand then how demographics fit into some of these questions, because I think one of my sort of pet peeves is when demographics are kind of presented, you know, detached from the places where they are. And so I think it can be useful to to learn methods to attach, you know, demographic information to more kind of precise spatial information. So this just kind of goes through quickly. So in this comparison, taking the 1970 census data from the tracts at the time, which you can see are much larger, right? Because census tracts are usually meant to contain roughly as close as possible about 5,000 people. So the size and shape of them change with every kind of update of the usually every year in some places. In comparing that to in this case, not the 2020 census, because it was done before, but the 2019 American Community Survey. And so to kind of, you have this, first, you visualize both time periods, and then casting the net in a way is a way of allowing the grid to kind of normalize the data both spatially and well, mostly spatially, mostly gets around that problem, but also could help kind of in terms of averaging out. And in what these are actually showing is not the population totals, but the density, which in a way also, when you represent the density in this grid, is really just showing you population totals again, because it's normalized against the area. And then using another mode of representation, in this case color, to overlay another layer of information, which is median household income, right? I think this is just showing the same thing in a different way. And then finally, using crunching some numbers, letting GIS crunch some numbers to then visualize that question of, is this place growing or shrinking? Where, how much, how quickly, how fast? So in this case, the blue is showing decreases in density by scale, and the pink is showing increases in density by scale. And this is a kind of pattern which it repeats a lot in North American cities, this kind of almost like melting of the core and producing this thickened outer rim. And then, what about climate? So in this case, also, doing a kind of similar study, but also bringing in something, showing the similar phenomenon, right? This kind of de-densification of the core, which is borders Juarez, Mexico, and the kind of densification of this outer ring. And utilizing, most recent Landsat data actually allows you to calculate land surface temperature. And so, utilizing Landsat in the way that it's really meant to be used, and is often used by kind of landscape ecologists and researchers as a kind of pixel extraction method. And the pixel can mean many different things, but in this case, the false color analysis is tuned to look for vegetation, and these have been extracted and kind of vectorized. And so just overlaying these two types of data, land surface temperatures, and this is a little light, land surface temperatures, along with current kind of vegetation coverage, and then also overlaying another layer of that data, in this case, the kind of HOLC map from, can't remember what date that actually is from, but to try and find a kind of index of one of how this place is changing, but also what are some of the longer term spatialized effects of planning policies that were implemented in the past. And then, I'll kind of go quickly also through, so this comes back to kind of Menard's work and looking at another data set, in this case, just kind of statistical economic data. And this kind of came from this exhibition that I worked on with Felipe Correa and Jonah Koscharf in 2019 for Chicago Architecture Biennial, which was, in addition to kind of designing these curved walls, doing some kind of mapping, looking at these various resources, raw material resources that were being extracted from South America, and kind of looking at their footprint, but also understanding the index of their kind of flow, and also how many times they're kind of crossing over the ocean as they become more complexified goods. And also showing how things like, a lot of times global trade today is often kind of putting off, one type of effect for another. So in this case, showing that this is the map on the right is showing trade of soy, right? And showing that actually, a lot of these countries that are buying soy can actually grow soy themselves, but what they really want is to conserve their own water. And so there's a kind of proxy embedded into that as well. So I'll kind of wrap up really quickly. So anyway, the methodology for this looks at the harmonized code system, which is the method used to encode all goods. So there are 22 different categories of broad categories of goods within the harmonized code. And this kind of represents, what portion of the economy, the global economy, they're picking up. Another kind of tree visualization of that. And then using these because basically attached to all of these figures is an origin and a destination. So they're not inherently spatialized, but they can be, and it's a kind of proxy for materials as they flow through the, across the globe. It's not a perfect approximation, but it starts to produce a kind of interesting index of geopolitical relationships. But it also points to clues about where you can begin to look on the ground for evidence of these kinds of activities. And a couple of other case studies looking at land reclamation in Singapore in relation to legal sand trade, or tracing the kind of trade of palm oil on Borneo in relation to the map on the right showing fire data, a whole year's worth of fire data, and how it's kind of intersecting with an emergent road network. So the kind of fires as one being used to clear agricultural land, but also spread a new kind of urbanistic footprint on the landscape. So I'll end it there. I'm a couple minutes over, but thank you all so much.
Hey everyone. So I'm the last speaker at the end of the last session of a long day. My remarks are about 2.5 hours or so. But it's super nice to be here. Ali, thank you for the invitation. It's really, I've learned so much from the day, and the problem with going last is that I would probably change a lot of my presentation now. But I wanted to try to think about, in the context of, let's say, my broader work on questions of infrastructure and logistics. I wanted to think about this question posed by the topic of urbanism after data and the relationship between data and urbanism, and what makes this moment that we're in especially challenging, but maybe also interesting. And I think that generally speaking, we're dealing with this, over the course of the day, we've been looking at different ways that platform urbanism's use of data has sort of flattened the urban to a variable that one can solve for. And I'm curious about, I've been getting excited about some kind of writers who've been looking at the kind of minor figure, the thing that we don't really want to talk about, or the thing that sort of tends to be acting in a different kind of relationship to a kind of more major node. So I want to sort of think about what that could look like. But first, I wanted to tell you a story about sheep. And maybe some of you know this game, or Ultima Online. This was like one of the really early MMORPG games. And there was an amazing coverage of this into like an early Elizabeth Colbert article in the New Yorker about this game. And the upshot is basically it took the developers like 2 years to build out this world, and they were really excited about modeling the behavior of what we would call now like an open world platform. So the sheep are going to be sheep, and the wolves are going to be wolves, and the sheep know what to do, and the wolves will know what they do, and they'll all just kind of do their thing in this kind of beautiful equilibrium of ecological self-regulation, where the wolves, when there are too many wolves, then people will start to regulate them. When there's too many sheep, etc. Timber wolves. So these wolves would get smarter and smarter as they live longer, and all this would go on even if no one was playing. So they were super excited about this. It went live. You can guess what happened. It went live like end of September. By the first week of October, there were no sheep left. There were no wolves left. There were no trees left. Everything was basically decimated because of players. Basically, as soon as people had access to this open world, they could do whatever they wanted to do, which was basically just like consume the entire thing. And so for me, as a kind of parable for the role of data modeling, I think this is something that I think about often, that there's this, the models are so full of assumptions, and that once they're sort of unleashed, that there are so many ways that those assumptions can be then misunderstood or be read otherwise. And so what, in the end, in Ultima's case, what they did is they just turned off all the limits. So they were now just unlimited sheep and unlimited wolves and unlimited trees. And so it was this kind of regenerating landscape, but it didn't work out the way that they were hoping. And so I think for me, the reason I was thinking about this is I was thinking about the title, Urbanism After Data. And I was thinking, I wonder if that's less of a kind of historical marker, like, what is urbanism now that we're dealing with ubiquitous data the way that we are, but what if it's more about like historical, that like first data, then urbanism. So urbanism after data. And so in a way, I was thinking that maybe that actually has to do with, something actually that Reed mentioned at the beginning of the session, that in a way, urban and data have always been intertwined. So was there ever an urban without data? And I think that this is something that I've been excited about some of the way people have been trying to now kind of theorize infrastructure. One of them is John Durham Peters' book, The Marvelous Cloud. And I like this passage where he makes a distinction between, he goes to lengths to not describe it as new media, but as digital media. And he writes that compared to mass media, digital media, which is the media that we're sort of immersed in, did seem like an enormous historical rupture. But if we place digital devices in the broad history of communication practices, new media can look a lot like old or even ancient media. Like new media, ancient media like registers, indices, the census, to Devin's presentation, calendars, catalogs, they've always been in the business of recording, transmitting, and processing culture. In other words, of managing subjects, objects, and data, of organizing time, space, and power. So I think for me to think about then the sort of relationship between urban and then the organization of time, space, and power, we start to then see all of these kinds of historical examples where data has become a kind of precondition. And these are all familiar, so I'm not going to like linger on any of these things, but of course, like a precondition of urban was accumulation of surplus grain. So you could have specialized knowledge and you wouldn't have to be subsisting in an unpredictable agricultural space, which is also linked in a way to Claire's project. So this is an image of the Swiss Mills Tower, but of course, population has been a huge part of data driven. We just saw this from Devin. I probably no, this is coordinated. It's sort of nicely all segued. But I mean, we know that this has become, none of these are neutral. These are all incredibly problematic ways of measuring and of deploying data. So the idea of constructing a norm, the idea of constructing both sort of a demographic norm, a bodily norm, these things we know are incredibly problematic. Where we just saw the homeowners corporation security maps. And I think these, so not only were these a kind of mediating tool for propagating the heavily racist policies, they were also neutralized as documents. So these weren't, these were seen as normal things to do. This was like a way of basically mediating a set of really ugly policies through the kind of neutral document of a map. Not only that is, but at the same time, property is one of these like seemingly unassailable pieces of data when we think about cities, and the data itself, the idea that information, that how we access information is sort of a key piece of urbanization. In this case, this is Peter Gallison's study of the way that the freeway system in a way preceded the distributed network of the internet through basically data sets generated from planning experts who were then asked to destroy their own cities after World War II. So in a certain sense, user data being used to then pursue an agenda that was incredibly, in a certain way, easy to roll out, much harder to unroll. So, but here we are. We're now at this moment where, even if, of course, data has always been part of the city, something is different. And so, I think that question of what is materially different is worth noting and worth thinking about. So, I think it has to do with, these are, again, this is all sort of obvious, but for me, it was helpful to kind of like, just kind of try to put these things into words, like what is happening here compared to what was happening before. And it's all kind of obvious to say it. I mean, that's what I've been sort of worried about all day. Like, of course, this is all obvious to everyone, but I'm saying it anyway. I mean, we're dealing with this question of scale, and then I think also of variety, and then also of quantity. And then that's breeding, I think, a new set of questions to deal with. One of those is typological, and then one of those is imaginary. It has to do with a kind of poverty of imagination. And it's in the face of the sort of platform capitalism and platform urbanism, where these kinds of systems tend to overdetermine outcomes, which I think is one of our biggest challenges. How do we get out from under the ways in which these structures will kind of tend to reinforce themselves? So in the kind of logic of platform urbanism and platform capitalism, it creates a problem that then presents itself as the solution. So, we're dealing with this incredible sort of variety of information. I included this just because I love Lorna Mills and I can't help it. And I wanted to put this slide in here. Fidelity, how do we sort of deal with the kind of question of translation, the quantity of data that produces then this whole set of other infrastructural pieces. This is also an amazing sort of image of ridiculous kind of posturing. This is Jeff Bezos on top of a wind farm christening it, showing off his like time in the gym, I guess. But just the idea that we have so many Amazon Web Services now is so big that it needs so much more power that it can't possibly run itself unless it produces its own controllable set of reliable energy sources. I mean, this is a really astonishing set of relationships between data and urbanism. And then of course, typologies, as we've seen, this is a distribution center, but we also know that has to do with data centers and then geographies too. So this whole set of transforming kinds of urban conditions is the Huawei headquarters outside of Shenzhen. So this is a picture I took actually with Orit when we were both in Songdo working on our testbed urbanism article. But I like it because it shows Songdo under construction and then in a way kind of talks about the ongoingness of smart cities. And I think that we've sort of now we're seeing in the sort of within this platform urbanism space, there's the kind of mega project category like Songdo, like Masdar, like Neom, which has this whole other governance side of it, which I won't really go into, but it's a fascinating piece that the part of the attraction of the sort of horrifying proposal of Neom is also there's this kind of like extra governmental existence that you can then enjoy if you're a resident of it. And then there's also the kind of platform side of it, the much more decentralized urban transformations that things like Airbnb and Uber and Amazon and Sidewalk have all produced. And so I think for me, like what I think is the one of the questions about this intersection of urbanism and data we see in a kind of product like this one from Sidewalk Labs, where you can procedurally generate any number of configurations of different kinds of units and public, like, you know, green equals public space somehow. And then this can just go on and on and on, but that seems to then be a bit rudderless. So, you know, what guides this? And of course, it's all super well intentioned, and the idea is that this provides a kind of equitable distribution of affordable housing units and access to light and air and all of the things, which I think is significant. But at the same time, I wonder about whether we know what questions we're asking with technology like this. And it seems like we've sort of seen over the course of the day different kinds of categories. There have been, in some cases, data being used to reveal patterns, in some cases, data being used like this to sort of show alternatives and optimize processes, or data being used to create sort of hallucinatory images through OpenAI. And I'm wondering whether, you know, what are our sort of escape routes from this? Because I have a feeling that there's something like this will tend toward, you know, it tends toward an optimization approach where, as I was saying earlier, the urban becomes a kind of variable to solve for rather than a process to sort of immerse oneself in. And so I think it's worth noting that data are media, and that they require media to be moved around, and that we are in this period that's much less like the mass media age of the 20th century. This is Peters again. Digital media traffic less in content, programs, and opinions than in organization, power, and calculation. Digital media serve more as logistical devices of tracking and orientation than in providing unifying stories to the society at large. Digital media revive ancient navigational functions. They point us in time and space. They index our data and they keep us on the grid. And we've seen this kind of pluralization happen in our various kinds of competing versions of reality over the last few years, where the different kinds of processes and events that have unfolded have depend a lot on where you find truth, and what data you avail yourself to create your version of reality. And I think that reality has been so pluralized is one of the things that we're trying to make sense of. All of these things are physical, and I think this is mostly what I want to talk about in the rest of it today is that all that data exists somewhere. And that's the kind of very literal latent landscape of data that I want to kind of focus on this afternoon for the rest of the session, or the rest of this presentation, which is really just the sort of like the role that these data centers play in our cities, how to understand the footprint of data, the architecture of the internet, basically. What does it look like? Where is it? What do we do with it? How do we understand it? And so these things have been happening through a kind of graphic approach, through some studio and research work, where we've been trying to look at, and different students working with me have been looking at ways of trying to visualize these things as multi-scalar systems. So these aren't like data visualizations in the sense that we're not sort of these aren't like computational documents. These are really, you call them like illustrations, I guess, of a range of diverse archives that we've compiled and then tried to make sense of by showing them in multiple transscalar relationships, let's say. So this is describing the footprint of Digital Realty, which is one of the largest data center holders. And really, they were just trying to show where it exists, but to put it all in this kind of in relationship to each other, you start to see these patterns of density and relationships that these data centers have, but you also start to see that there's no kind of abiding typological consistency in data center, that in fact it's a totally heterogeneous sort of field. Or this, in this case, just trying to relate correlations between Google's like technical activities, like what does it mean when how do you send an email, and where do those packets go as they move through the various networks, but then also how does that correlate to the kind of the energy footprint as they've diversified with their products, and how does that happen in space? And the idea is somehow by combining all of these simultaneously, we can start to both sort of understand the relationships better, but perhaps also provoke some kind of pattern finding within it. The same thing, we were doing the same thing for Meta, for Amazon Web Services, and then or for Facebook in New York City, or for other forms of less kind of corporate pieces. So this is the sort of traffic management in New York City. And so all of this is, for me, has been kind of like useful to think about around, well, I guess I've been a little frustrated, like personally not finding sort of good entry points, but I was been reading through some of these, the much more developed work around this, some of the thinking that looks for ways kind of that tries to get out of this binary, basically, between one or the other, between the digital and non-digital, between the technological and non-technological. And I found, well, one, I think CNI's text is really amazing for its ability to sort of understand and to think through what it would mean to act in a certain state of suspension. But then Cindy Katz's text called About Minor Theory has been, for me, a really exciting one. So she writes that minor theory is at once multiply porous and a way to squeeze. It opens possibilities as it distills new kinds of knowledge. It might be best conceptualized as interstitial. And I think that idea, I mean, it's familiar if we're talking about infrastructure, but an interstitial space to try to kind of articulate, for me, it's exciting to start thinking about what would be a minor infrastructure, like what would be minor data infrastructure, something that would not repeat the sort of errors of the past around imagining the kind of mega project, but at the same time, it wouldn't give up on the kind of possibilities of a larger transformation. It wouldn't give up on the alternative worlds that I think Maria was pointing to earlier. And I think there's great evidence of that in lots of places where people are working around this. The Platform Cooperativism Consortium is an example. The School of Poetic Computation, James Bridle's Data Farm project, for example. And so I was thinking about this then, if that, these kind of earlier examples that I was showing, if we could think about this as a kind of a spectrum from like the kind of, let's say, more like major side to a more minor side. And I think Katz is interesting in her text because she's doesn't describe them as having, neither of them have primacy. It's not that one is sort of better or worse. It's more that they're in this kind of relationship with each other. And so, I mean, for me, I'm just thinking about this now, but I'm trying to think through it. So how do we start thinking about finding value systems outside of some of the things that tend to be overdetermining through platform urbanism? So, for example, there's often, I have encountered it, maybe, I don't know if you guys have also, in the design studio, for example, there's often a kind of internalized, like efficiency, for example, in my experience with students, is internalized almost to like an ethical level, like it's sort of, like a moral level. Like if something's inefficient, it's like, yeah, people get super nervous if you say like, well, maybe it doesn't have to be, maybe that's not the goal. And so I think that for me is sort of re-inscribed in all of these kind of computational logics. So any like that Google product I was showing you, like that's about efficiency. So how do we sort of create variables for friction, for inefficiency? How do we find language for that? And I think that's where like the mesh network world is really exciting, because that to make a mesh network work, then you have certain kinds of very physical things that you need, like lines of sight. And I'm inspired by Rory Solomon's work on this. But I think, could we start to find language for this, like, and build it into the way we talk through urbanism and data and technology, where we can sort of find ways outside of some of these overdetermining features, like the mesh, like if there's a tendency toward high resolution and high definition, what's the kind of clunky low resolution version of this? What's the redundant version of the city? And these are some of the things we've been trying to look at with the studios, inspired by Xiaowei Wang's amazing blockchain chicken farm book and research on the role of technology in rural China to Mingfeng and Yishao. We're looking at how to take vernacular techniques, combine them with distributed data centers that are a huge part of current development mandates, and then to connect those to the very real needs of the rural populations. And we're speculating about how you could start to connect these different kinds of techniques that are display incredible amounts of expertise connected to small forms of distributed forms of data storage that then can be valuable locally, and then connect to various kinds of agricultural projects. Or how could we start to think about a monument that would actually like reflect all the sort of like messiness and weirdness of data if it becomes public? Like if we say data doesn't belong to corporations, but it actually is ours, it's us. So let it reflect us. And this is, I think, also being influenced by Nicholas Mack and Francesca Bria's work on data sovereignty. But I appreciated the kind of intensity that these two brought to their project. I like this one a lot. On the last, on the left here, this is imagining a kind of post-Amazon monopoly, knowing that Lena Khan is now at the FTC and has been pioneering a kind of way of understanding platform monopolies. These two authors were imagining that she would make good on this promise, and Amazon would be broken up into all sorts of like baby Amazons, but they would still need to find ways to support their data service supplies. So basically what they developed was this thing they called data church, which was this way of sort of imagining localized data centers, and then Amazon would produce all of these kinds of local data resources. And so this is this sort of tower, this scale is astonishing, but it's the same as the wind farm. So you would get in these sort of flatter Midwestern landscapes, you would start to see these things appearing. Or Sophia and Eastwood looked at a kind of idea of something like a civil service related to data monitoring, something like data jury duty, where you'd be called in once every 2 years to spend a week basically doing the vetting work to make sure that all the sort of data traffic is being done ethically. And then you would have these various kinds of programmatic pieces that would support that. And then some at a more systemic level in New York City, looking at different ways to cut back on. Students were finding that the people in the service industry were unsurprisingly commuting many hours and then returning to not having any resources, local like food desert kind of conditions. And so they looked for ways to kind of close that down. Close those loops so that one wouldn't need to be traveling so far, and as a result would be able to have more internal forms of economic self-reliance. Or on the right, a project that looks at thinking through the kinds of three-dimensional unused spaces in the city through not just the sort of zoning envelope overlaps, but all the kind of composite leftover spaces that one might be able to inhabit. So this is my last slide. I wanted to just put this into this typological moment to say the data center, I think, is this, to sort of pose it as a typological problem makes it maybe seem more mundane, but I think it's very profound to encounter something like a new kind of infrastructure, a new kind of typological piece. I don't want to make typology into a kind of a postmodern architectural question, but to really say, like, we have been confronting this totally unstable new kind of piece of the city, which is these massive data containers, and we don't yet know what to do with them. And they are storing all of this material that belongs to us, that represents us, that is us. And yet we have no way to really think through how to make them part of the city yet. I mean, Claire's work maybe is a wonderful exception in this search. And so I think about these kind of earlier examples of something like the train station. Here was this new technology. We didn't have a train station before trains. No one knew what to do with it. People weren't very good at using them to start with. But just the idea that there's a certain point where the technology is housed within a thing, but it also might burst forth in that thing, and it might transform the city in the process. And I think this is where we are. But I think it's really essential that we're as vigilant as possible to find ways outside of the kind of overdetermining logics of these data systems. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. So my job that I was given by Ali is to come up with themes, and then of course to ask questions. And this is a diverse set of presentations. So my themes are efficiency and aesthetics, ordering and imagining, neutralizing or politicizing, pixels and population, and sheeps and cows. But I think that this has like a fascinating, set of questions that kind of comes across from these three presentations. And the first one I think is about legibility, and each of your work is in some ways, struggling with or revealing what are these invisible systems to begin with, and then how do we start to teach students to think about them? How do we start to ask different questions, as you said, Devin? How do we start to connect this to kind of ways of understanding theories and the world? So I'm curious, does this legibility create different agency for our field, for our students? Do we start to have a different role in terms of what the work that we're doing?
Can you talk more about legibility, like to who it's legible, and like what legibility and what sense?
Well, I think there's an element of all of this work that is about revealing a hidden system, revealing the invisible. And how does what is the agency of design or the architect in that role?
I think that's maybe the problem with the project. Okay. Just when we did the pavilion, I remember at one point the kind of crisis of going, this is all we're doing. It's an indexical project. We're just revealing, we're trying to show the material footprints of data. And these are the kind of components or the artifacts that help us tell that story. But then that was the story. And I think that we have to go beyond revealing. So the agency is using the reveal instrumentally, whether that's through projective design or understanding the city in a different way. For me, it can't just be the indexical project. It has to be something else, because otherwise we're just reduced to what? We're illustrators for larger infrastructural problems in the case of data infrastructure. And I don't think that's the best form of agency we can have as designers. And so I think we're in a little bit of a conundrum. It's back to kind of even just formal language or how you communicate these things. What are the drawing techniques that we have available to us? I think we're at a kind of, we haven't mastered the agency yet. That's what I would say. I mean, the agency looks beautiful and I love the project, but somehow there has to be something else. And
Yeah.
I think it's a great question. I mean, for me, the revelatory dimension isn't about then affecting some like crisis of conscience on the part of a hypothetical viewer. I think it's really about the revelatory dimension that it has for the author of the document, and then how that could help isolate, identify the. I mean, I think for me, they're pattern-seeking documents that then point to different points of different, to use metas as idea, language, the different leverage points within these systems. So for me, the value of doing those sort of multi-scalar drawings is you start to see where there are certain kinds of pressure points, which for my hope, my larger kind of event, where I see the possibility of expanding agency design wise, is to claim design engagement for things that have thought to be outside of that, especially infrastructural systems, which are not thought to be sort of projects of design. They're thought to be engineering projects. And there's and so then when you say, well, I want to get involved designing that, people think oh, you'll make it pretty or something like that. I mean, I was just on the radio show about this and someone was like, can you make them pretty? And it was really, I was trying to be really polite, but it's just for me, not the point. It's not about that. It's about how we think about the effects of these things. And so for me, I guess the revelatory dimension is about then the first step along a pathway toward seeing where that agency can expand by claiming or by making a case for the value of design in those spaces.
Yeah, and maybe I might answer the question in a slightly different way, or maybe at least in terms of how I'm thinking about it. I think agency is a really important part of that, and I guess for me, the sense that I have, in an earlier presentation, to say that data is a medium and requires media for transmission, and I think is an important revelation, because I also get the sense that the abundance of it and the abundance of visual media and visual culture and data at large, and also the overwhelming feeling of all these kind of mounting problems in the built environment requires a kind of antidote. So for me, I think legibility is, you can think of it either as a strategy or as a somehow a byproduct of trying to develop ways of kind of cutting through what can seem like an impenetrable amount of information, and to be at least specific with yourself as the author about what you're trying to accomplish, even if it doesn't look like you imagined it would or should at the end. I'm not sure if that fully answers the question, but I think for me, it's about finding points of entry through making, and then theorizing on it after having made something, I guess.
It's interesting that finding points of entry. I read once that the former head of the New York City data analysis department was saying, data doesn't actually tell us anything causal or it doesn't tell us what to do. It just tells us where to scratch further. I was struck by a couple of things at the end of your presentation, Jesse, saying this kind of embedded tendency to seek efficiency. And I was also thinking about, some of the overlap between your students' work with the data centers and your students' work, Claire, and a tendency toward decentralization. And it made me wonder, how do we break this apart, this huge, intimidating, typology that's landed in the form of these data centers? We have, maybe that we have an instinct to think, is this decentral? Is this centering, or is this mass? Is there some way to decenter it? And I'm just curious to hear if that was a theme among all of your students, if there were different takes on, if that became somewhat of the central problem or primary problem in the work.
Actually, that's probably no different than a lot of infrastructure driven studios, the kind of opposition of centralization and distribution sort of happens in a lot, like it happens in transportation systems. It happens in other infrastructural realms. I mean, in our case, and this is maybe a very practical question, you have maybe 12 or 14 students and you want to cover a lot of different ground. And so, you know, you'll have some groups looking at decentralized systems and maybe another group actually doubling down on the centralization, making it so big that you kind of push the system to an extreme condition, which is another tactic to pursue. I guess the distributed system maybe, and you know, even I would admit that even some of my work on this is kind of naive. You know, that while the Amazons of the world will probably, they like hyperscale facilities because there's an economy of scale to building one. But now I think with increasing pushback from public and municipalities, with decreasing land, you know, to host some of these facilities, and the energy question, that maybe the distributed model will emerge, not because of, you know, it was a design choice, but it's essential for them to continue with using other models. So yeah, I think it's a mixture between historical oppositions between centralized and decentral, and maybe new criteria that are emerging now that might force decentralization even against the logic of the system itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been trying to talk about even just kind of finding other language, you know, that doesn't reinforce either a periphery or a center, but to think about sort of horizontal ways of organization. I mean, I think for me, the bigger infrastructural question is about how to intervene in the kind of path-dependent tendencies of infrastructure to reinscribe itself in its own patterns. And so with the sort of, for me, the part of my interest in the sort of emerging phenomenon of the data center is that it gives us a moment to maybe intervene in some of the ways that they might take shape. And I think that's where because they're not really designed so much. So I think that the kind of way they manifest is a product of what's available. And we know from what Claire was saying about the Irish context of power is similar in the US. There's no power anymore. Like we can't build data centers anymore, really, because the grid won't support them. And so then what do we do? And so as a result, everything is going to start getting really weird, I think. And so, and then we have to, we can't use power plants anymore, which is great. But like in New York, you know, as all of these sort of local laws come into place, it won't be legal anymore. So then what does one do? And so all of these new kinds of things are starting to come on into our focus. And so I think the question of the ways that, I mean, for me, I think part of the question, I understand it, is about how infrastructure shows up in a way, like where does it appear and how do we make sense of it? And I think these are the things that you know, whether it's sort of centralized or decentralized is sort of, I think, part of a bigger conversation about the ways in which we engage it.
Do we have time for one more question? This question of leverage points is interesting. So I think there's an interesting tendency, even though we're looking at data and looking at its, often historically, looking at its the effect, or, you know, of these systems that we've put into place, and often, you know, critical, it reveals something that maybe we didn't consider up front. But we still have a tendency maybe to create a static response to it. And I think you're critiquing that, Jesse, saying like, well, how do we avoid that? A few years ago, we had data dialogues here, you know, kind of similar theme with many of the researchers here across grounds. And Brad Cantrell was presenting some of their geomorphology table and saying, you know, talking about design of landscape really is not even trying to simulate something accurately, just trying to learn a methodology of design that is an action and a reaction, and almost like it reminded me of computer codes, like we're designing a system. We're designing the leverage points and then studying what happens and modifying that. And I wonder if if there has been any emergence of that, since, you've all in a way been asking your students to design systems or be more aware of systems as an ingredient to empower a new way of thinking for designers. So is it leading us there to being designers of the system, to instead of designing static objects as architects, to say, how do we design something, study it, move it, change it?
Yeah, I'll try to- I mean, I think that, your comment about efficiency as a kind of, students feeling that, efficiency was a kind of moral or ethical imperative in their design is interesting, because I've heard the same thing often. And when I hear that, I often, try to say, well, our job isn't really necessarily to just solve a problem or to just design something efficiently, but is really to understand that whatever we do, there are trade-offs, and that, as designers, what our power and our agency is being able to having multiple ways of being able to understand, how our decisions and how interventions in the built environment or in nature can play out in multiple ways. And in that way, I think, that's one way in which I begin to see, I think, in how they respond to those kinds of prompts or those kinds of prodding, an understanding that actually, the agency is, that one, the medium of design isn't just the built object or the thing in space, but is also the media that's produced to kind of think through these multi-scalar, multi-dimensional, and, very weighty questions that designers are being asked to address.
I think no is probably the short answer. It's interesting. I was talking to Devin earlier on that he has both a landscape degree and an architecture degree, and I would certainly situate my work maybe in between landscape and architecture. Jesse, I don't know how you feel about, none of us really are architect with the capital A, or our project is not like about the formal object or the self-conscious project. And so for me, it's really less that we wouldn't end up designing systems, but we're interested in mobility and in flows and in relationships between things and how things get from A to B. And so, but I still think that we're designing spaces around those systems. I remember, was it Mark Womble, years ago, had this really nice term called system form, which was kind of a really nice way of moving between, we have an aesthetic practice, all of us, like we're designing things, but yet we're cognizant of the relationships and the backstage processes that go into that. And so I like that kind of term, system and form, as a kind of hybrid way to think about work. But I don't think, at least in my work, in some cases, the systems are alibis for the design project, as opposed to, I really want to redo the system itself. Yeah.
I think that the question of how does the various subfields within architecture and urbanism and landscape, how do they evolve to meet these challenges, I think is essential to keep thinking about. It's really inspiring to see the work from the day, to see I share Claire's enthusiasm that you were expressing to the middle panel, because I also am like in awe of that. Because it's easy to sit behind your computer, or sit in the archive. But so I think that then I think hanging on to what I guess I don't see them as mutually exclusive, that one can be trained in a métier around a certain skill set that is capable of understanding the consequences, the spatial, as Devin, you're pointing to, the kind of spatial implications of things, but then to not shy away from the ways those things can engage larger systems, but to also know where they can and where they can't, and not to sort of pretend that they could. And I think that's where I guess the question of how one engages a system, I think that's where how does one do that in a practical way? It seems to be about understanding that system better, and then creating that desire to engage it. So I think it's an ongoing question, and that I think we can keep looking for the tools to do that. And I think through everything is a system in a certain sense. So finding enthusiasm for that, I guess, for me, what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't feel right to say that now is the time to create more rarefied objects, or that now is the time for architects to really focus on the singular thing, but really to understand the way that what we do fits into these much bigger contexts, but not to give up on the things that we love about this.
Devin, with us?
No, I think that was really well stated.
We should give you some wrap-up time, Ollie.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And just as a formal wrap-up for the day, I promise I'm not gonna, take too much time. I just want to make sure to thank all of you for bringing fantastic insights into admittedly a vague and quite general kind of thematic for but it was really fantastic to see how each lens, how each kind of analytic methodology, how each presentation approaches similar questions but ends up in a clearly different place, and how those differences can be reassembled back together as a form of response to some of these kind of larger questions that are posed at the intersection of urbanism and data. So I thought it was a fantastic day, and thank you so much for your insights. For our moderators for posing fantastic questions and kind of keeping the discussion going. And I just want to bookmark this as the first of many. So hopefully we can again get together at a similar venue and discuss these topics, because I think we end up with questions as opposed to kind of finality of solutions. I think that's a good. So thank you.